Welcome to a new podcast called Living in the Entanglement, the hunt for our blind spots. This is a very far-ranging podcast in which we take on a topic of some magnitude, some difficulty, the concept of entanglement. And the idea was motivated by an essay by Danny Hillis that he did in the magazine for Design and Science, in which he talks about the Enlightenment is dead. Long live the entanglement. And what does he mean by entanglement? He certainly sets it as a contrast to the Enlightenment. And certainly when we think about the Enlightenment, we think about clarity. We think about reason. We think of science and the distillation of things and the breakdowns of things and the ordering of things. And the idea that we can gain prediction. And entanglement is a concept really taken from quantum mechanics that says, wait, everything's embedded, everything's fractal, everything's connected. We mutually construct things. So it's almost the inverse of what we mean by enlightenment. And this is a huge contrast. I think Danny's point in his essay, and I'll read a little bit from it in a minute, but is that our current way of understanding things is really inadequate. And we apply it to everything because it's predicated on an enlightened perspective. Ideas that are developed in the 17th century, and now we're in the 21st century. And we have a very different kind of physics, we have a different kind of world, we have a different kind of experience. And so we really need to recognize where we are and have an appropriate way of talking about it and thinking about it. And the key to one of his points is that our frameworks really determine our content and our conversation and what we do. We tend to think about the content in its own terms, but in fact, it's derived from the frameworks. And so he says something to the effect that we are what we make. We are our thoughts, whether they are created by our neurons or by our electronically augmented minds, by our technologically mediated social interactions, or by machines themselves. Very different concept than the Enlightenment concepts. We are our bodies. Whether they're born in womb or test tube, our genes are inherited, designed, organs augmented, repaired, transplanted, or manufactured. And that is the concept of nature as being separate from us is so much in Enlightenment that we have this objective perspective that we can stand upon, this Archimedean perspective, and then we can analyze and break down and have a subject-object relationship and be objective. In the entanglement, you recognize you mutually construct things. That your act of participating, your act of observing, your act of measuring, your act of quantifying is actually changing the physical state of the thing that you are directed at, and it changes you. And clearly this resonates with what we know about quantum physics and Heisenberg principle, etc. But it also recognizes the fact that we're creating new kind of quantum computing, that we're actually now implementing this technology. So we're constructing, we're understanding a new kind of reality that's very different than our common sense of reality. Our common sense of reality is a Newtonian world, in which we have time, we have distance and measure things in 3 dimensions. And we see things over time, and the entanglement says, well, not so fast. Everything's embedded in everything else that you can't even, maybe the concept of time, or this concept of time is a construct. It's not something that's absolute. And what we consider as information as being about something physical is in part a part of the physics itself. And that when we do quantum experiments, when we do quantum calculations, we're actually altering the physical state of things. And we sort of see this in a wide variety of experiences in our digital world, in our gaming world, where in effect we're interacting with those things, those digital constructs, our digital twins. And they are shaping us and we are shaping them. They're capturing part of us, and that part of us they capture, they embody, and it becomes increasingly autonomous. Again, this is sort of one of Danny's points. And I think that in that recognition, there's a new kind of mathematics, there's a new way of understanding it. And so the mathematics is governed by the mathematics of strange attractors. Its geometry is fractal. Its music is improvisational, as he says, generative rather than composed. It's, what he says instead of Mozart. It's art about process rather than the artifact themselves. So we're moving into a whole different kind of state, and this is very different than what the Enlightenment's about, in which instead of classifying organisms and we putting them in categories and breaking them down and modularizing them, we construct them. To understand something is not to classify it, or even it's to build it, it's to experience it, and we don't discover so much, and we create them. And we're interactively creating them. And then the next step is that we create artifacts themselves that create their own world. So this movement into autonomy. So our reference points for understanding things in our coordinate space for trying to govern ourselves and understand ourselves is being radically redefined. And so when we start to build things, we don't necessarily build them the traditional way. Again, we'll talk about generative design. This is something we'll get into more and more in using genetic algorithms to design things. And there are wonderful examples of this that we'll be looking at from Autodesk and elsewhere, where they use generative design to create all different kinds of artifacts and go from that generative design to actually 3D printing. But that's just the early part of the process. And so what I would like to do is sort of drill down on these concepts of what entanglement entails, but also in the context of being able to challenge some of our most established thoughts, the things, the dogmas that we think are true. My experience in a long time of science is just when it seems to be settled science, and this is a challenging concept, very often the opposite is true. We've seen this time and time again. That becomes scientific dogma. Actually, the inverse is true, or we get new kinds of insight. This is not to undermine the legitimacy of science and say it's fake science or any stupid thing like that. It's to say you have this process of sort of closure, formation of dogma, and then you say, well, what's the counterexample? Because science itself is a social construct. Yes, there's the process of methods, and you try to make things, state them in such a way they can disprove, but unfortunately human interest intercedes, and people do not want to access their prestige and their influence to something, a counter theory or a new interpretation that renders them not as prominent as they were. So there's a social component of what is constitutes legitimate science. And fortunately, that one can construct experiments, we can create artifacts, and they make these things testable and refutable, and that's the whole point. And what I want to do is sort of look at certain those areas of dogma, the things that I have, and this is sort of a practice I use for myself, is when I think I absolutely know something and I'm certain, and the person on the other side is an idiot, and then how could they possibly do that? Well, why don't I just suddenly try to walk in their shoes and see the world through and see something I don't see, and maybe I have a blind spot. And I think this concept of blind spots is really important, because in order to form a coherent understanding of things, you actually create a blind spot. You have to preclude things, and you organize it around things that confirm that particular point of view and fit into that pattern. And we know this is confirmation bias, but in some sense, it can actually lead to insight and create new models and understanding, and it actually sustains itself. It's not necessarily a blind spot, but in many cases, it can be a blind spot. So there's some really interesting areas of blind spots in science currently, I think, that are worthy of exploration, particularly when we're going through this transition from the notion of enlightenment and reason. And you will hear many, many people on the scientific community argue vehemently about this concept of rational actors, and I believe in reason, and I believe in the objective verification of science, and this is where I anchor my arguments, and they will refute these other things as being sort of ill-formed and muddled. But in fact, muddledness and connectedness in the difficulty of disentangling things is sort of the honest way of looking at our current understanding. And I think what we're discovering more and more in scientific method is that when we do observations and organize experiments, and we think that we have independent variables, we're able to isolate the variables and replicate the sets, it's not the case. It's much more complex than that, and we can't replicate the experiments. And this has become a methodological challenge The idea that you can say, well, we assume it's a normal distribution and that this random and that they're not, these variables will have equal probability, and then through the scientific method we can identify and isolate those things explaining the variance. Well, lo and behold, you may not know what the full reference point of your universe is, and there are things that you do not apply, and that you may be looking at something that is in one state at one point and lacks that one, and you change the state and it becomes a whole nother kind of phenomena. And of course, this is what we're finding in biology and epigenetic phenomena. And the fact that we think that they're isolated effects, and lo and behold, they're actually triggers and events that are external to the thing itself that we're studying, that they change, but that is creating selective pressure. So it becomes much more complex. But I think in going back to, I recommend Danny's piece, and Danny is quite I think in the sort of the MIT lore, is one of those real polymaths, and our paths had crossed many, many years ago when we both started companies at about the same time. Actually, I had similar investors. Both had a Bailey Gifford, which is a Scottish hedge fund, actually very active now, but made a lot of money. I think it was off Amazon. I was an investor in his company, but Danny was sort of ahead of the curve. He started a company called Connection Machine. They had 10,000 kind of small little, what they call SIMD processors. And he was into connectionism, and before anybody else. We're talking at least 30 years ago. And actually what we are in AI was very similar. Where AI is now is some of the same issues are getting turned over again. There's an issue about connectionism, sort of connection machines, earlier neural nets. But he designed one, and he raised a lot of money, and he started a company called Connection Machine. And they had their own French chef. They'd have their retreats in Newport with nothing but food, and Richard Feynman was a good friend of Danny's, and he had a fire engine he rode around, and he was really sort of cutting new ground. And where our paths overlapped was we both worked with Dow Jones and a man named Bill Dunn, who was one of the real innovators in online information services, worked early with Steve Jobs to get the quotes off the Wall Street Journal, and he's really trying to put your Wall Street Journal into becoming a data business. This is even before Bloomberg was started, and actually he anticipated Bloomberg, and he knew where that was going. But he called me, Bill Dunn called me and said, I'm buying one of these connection machines. And I said, gee, that's very brave of you. And he said, well, I want to create, been writing about things like information refineries, and we can take a lot of information and analyze it and see patterns and sell that to our customers, and they're getting new analytics. And as again, Dave Waltz develops new methods for doing, who came out of MIT and develops new methods for doing that. So we think we can bring those insights to our customers. And I said, well, how much are you paying for these things? And he said, well, I have to go before my board of directors. It's a major purchase. I think it was something like $12 million. I said, wow, that's a lot of money. But he said, yeah, that'll position us to be really ahead of anyone else. And I said, you really sort of are that anyway. But Bill was a very iconoclastic guy. He drove a motorcycle, a Porsche, got in a lot of trouble, very verbal. They wouldn't let him talk. And when they had congressional panels and they had to speak before it, they wouldn't let Bill talk because they had no idea what he would say. So he was definitely a maverick, and he's pushing the envelope. But lo and behold, they gave him the money to buy these connection machines. And these connection machines were beautiful. I mean, they were black. They had these dancing lights, and just it was sort of, yes, you saw there's sentient intelligence in there, and it's a sort of a mystical experience to engage these things. And so when they started to unload them, they fell off the carrier, and the walls fell off. And lo and behold, this rather large machine, there's like one board. It was mostly air. And Bill was kind of horrified at that. And it was a challenge to him. And I said, well, Bill, I mean, you can put more boards in, and don't worry about it. And there were those detractors who would say, well, listen, you could have a SIMD machine, you could optimize this spatial chipset, and you could actually, for a fraction of cost, build something like that. But Bill was going for the big picture, and they put them online. And it worked. And now Connection Machine did not make it. But Danny went on to start other companies, and he was going to Applied Mind and actually developed a knowledge representation system that we see that's working in Google. And he's always been a big thinker, and Long Now Foundation, actually, I think, has published this piece. This is a bit of a digression, but I think that what it illustrates, and you can see some of the same themes that are going on here today at the time. I mean, connectionism, neural networks have now taken off. We have the computational speed in order to do these things, and out of that sheer computational capacity, you're starting to get new kinds of insights. But I think it's more than that. I think that we are thinking about things in ways that we never thought about them before, but not only think about things in the ways we never thought about them before, but also we're creating new technologies, and we're creating new ways of living and acting and understanding and creating new kinds of institutions. And so some of the bigger themes that we want to investigate here and pursue is, what are those? And how does new way of thinking, particularly when we start to design, and one of the things I'm interested in is new kinds of infrastructure around data, around privacy, around institutions, how we govern ourselves, how we think of ourselves, and how we think of ourselves as being governed and governing and involved in this whole process. There's certain assumptions we make about ourselves as, quote, rational actors, for example, that are not valid. We're not rational actors. More and more the neuroscience, and this is something we'll get into another episode. We'd love to get some people on here who can go on a deeper dive in this. But increasingly we understand that reason follows emotion, that what we argue for and reason about is really calibrated by our feelings, prior feelings. And so if you're under a stress, or you're under a certain kind of state, emotional state, you're going to reason in a particular way in order to explain or justify that. That's a very important insight. And I think we did go deeper in that. You're going to see a lot of assumptions about how we design our institutional process, like informed consent, what constitutes freedom, balance of power. A lot of the mechanisms that we assume there's a rational actor notion in it, that people can make these decisions out of context and arrive at something in their own self-interest. And I think the science, particularly neuroscience, but a variety of other findings are sort of invalidating that. The other thing is that there's some certain assumptions that we make, not only about our being rational actors, but also I'm very interested in the future of computing and how we understand and how we understand ourselves as metaphors and computer. I mean, in my own experience, in my modeling that I did in PhD thesis, and it became a book, it was, so it was like, well, you use the metaphor as the cognitive machine as understanding how people process information. And at that time, that was a radical idea. But we constantly think in metaphors. But now we have much stronger metaphors around the science, particularly what we're looking in bioinformatics and the biological science at the intersection of neuroscience and quantum and physics and computer science. And is that we as storage and information processing mechanisms may have much greater capacity for processing information at every level. It's not just sort of isolated into the brain, it's throughout our whole body as a processing mechanism. And so I'll reference this as a sort of a way of challenging certain assumptions about how people process, not only process information in the current, but pass it on. And to give you a feeler for this, or a tease, is that there's a company that is spun out of MIT, is developing DNA storage and computing. And what they've been able to do is store 200 petabytes on a single gram of DNA. And that's an enormous amount of storage. And then if you extrapolate that, and this may not be entirely correct, but if there's evident, there are figures that say there's some 2 zettabytes of data that is created annually on the internet as a whole, using that kind of storage mechanism without any compression. is roughly, say, 20, 25 pounds of DNA or fluid. And it's not only you can do the storage and it's highly stable, but you can also do the calculations, basically, because everything's communicating with the others. So our concept of modularity and breaking down of our rational computer, the serial von Neumann computer concept, is really now sort of obsolete. We're seeing future computing being chemistry. And of course, the consumption of power is a fraction of what it is now. So it's a natural thing for us to do. But also, it's also something about our own bodies. So that we got 6 trillion cells, 1 trillion, 6 trillion, plus biomes, that all these have their own DNA compression. They're going to be natural selection with some kind of compression, developing signals, passing information on. There's a real inclination that we actually capture and store much more information than we're constantly aware of. And this again sort of challenges the tradition of rational. So, well, we are aware of what we're doing. Freud came with an unconscious, and whoops, how's that? Now we know the brain works, how it works. Indeed, Kahneman, you'll talk about the fast and slow cognition, and much of what we do is unconscious and fast, and there's an evolutionary reason for that. And now, when we move understanding new kind of storage mechanism, the degree to which we can store things, God knows we can even do it on a quantum level. We study this, and there's a huge amount of information that people can store, and there's probably evolutionary advantage to that, and there's also evolutionary advantage to being able to pass that on. What I'm setting up is one of the dogmas of evolution and biology, and of course you find this body in Dawkins, but there's a whole group that's believes very strongly in the idea of individual selection, the selfish gene premise that the selection is on the single gene level, not at the group level, not multi-level selection, as you see in E.O. Wilson and what he has argued, and the evolutionary dynamics group at Harvard with Novak, written some very compelling papers, and it's to me it seems to make very sense that rather than having when you have repeat games, you have complex forms of cooperative behavior, have higher outcomes and better evolutionary outcomes than single one-player games. So it's not all a zero-sum game. So we're moving into a very, very different notion of not only sort of how do we understand evolution and cooperation, but maybe there are mechanisms for the transmission of learning acquired characteristics across generations. This is the heresy of heresies, but there's some really interesting work that's been coming out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel. There was a lecture at MIT not too long ago, which they explored these, and they can see them in epigenetic phenomena. And then the question is the chicken and egg, is a somic, a germic, germ cells, and how does that work? And now we're starting to understand how these mechanisms might work, and you understand how the selection for ability to not only capture information and pass it on, or be able to develop compression signatures around this, leads to a very different understanding of how things are entangled. So there you go. There's the two areas. And then one other area that I'd like to set up, and we'd like to have some conversations with people, is this notion, as I referred to earlier, that I often like to go to those places that I most disagree with. And I think I'd probably share this with most of the people listening to the podcast, is that if you have certain religious fundamentalists, that means people, the flat earth, people who are good dinosaurs who 6,000 years, whatever, and then they have their conversations with God, and they have these experiences of these spirits and emanations that they talk to, and it has a very powerful effect upon their life. It directs their life. And then when you look actually historically and across different populations, there are these themes that people have. They have them talking to spirits. They're talking to having all these kinds of revelations or emanations, and then you can find it in the poetic ledger, and then you actually can find it in people like Jung. I mean, it's parts of his. It's really hard to fathom and say how can that be? Well, actually, there's some really interesting research done this by a number of people, and particularly out of Stanford, we reference, who are ethnographers and neuroscientists, and you start to separate. Well, yes, it's not that the spirits exist, but it's this capacity to create a sort of symbolic other has certain, and it has its own status, it has evolutionary advantage. And whoa. And then we see what's happening with the new kinds of psychedelics and psilocybin and things like that, psilocybin, I should say, that we're understanding new kinds of hallucinogenics and the impact upon unfreezing certain kind of lock-ins that people have on their mental capacity. And you say, well, maybe you open up and you can access things. And that actually ties into certain concepts around systems theory and control theory, that actually you need to have a randomization, you get lock-ins, and so there's an evolutionary advantage for actually scrambling things and conjuring up a variety of different personas. And then we start to look at how the human sense of self evolves, our own sense of consciousness, and we recognize that it's not uniform. There were many selves, and then there are reasons to believe why that's evolutionally a strong system, that you can have many different selves, and you don't, failure in one is a sense of self. Failure in one doesn't bring down the whole ship. So there's something like neural Darwinism, Jerry Adelman's work. So these heresies around common, what are considered to be commonly accepted truths, are really worth exploring. And I think they're worth exploring in the context of this concept of entanglement, that we are in a different mentality about what constitutes reality, how we test it, how we build things around it, how we experience things, and how we explain things. And at some point, I want to take that into how we build new kinds of social institutions and how we resolve the conflicts that we're having with nature itself. Because we have created mechanisms that are at variance with nature. And it's in our imperfect understanding of it. And in doing that, we create these externalities, and so-called markets. And their social and environmental externalities that themselves are not really externalities. They actually have a detrimental influence on both. So we need a different way of envisioning these things. And the concept of entanglement starts to capture that. So this is a first cut at this conversation. But in subsequent discussions, we want to be able to focus on particular projects and do a deeper dive, and sort of challenge some of the key assumptions behind my those points of view, and maybe get some speakers come in and have some really lively conversation. So at this point, maybe 30 minutes of my chatter, sign off.